sermon last week and the one today is loosely based on the New York Times best-selling author Tim Keller's book, Hidden Christmas. And this is part number 2. And in this particular lesson, what I want to just briefly suggest for your thought this morning is not only has the true meaning of Christmas often been hidden in culture and in society, but all too often the true meaning of Christmas has been hidden even in the church. What I mean by that is that the church regularly, especially around this time of year, will often direct our attention to the stories of Scripture about the birth of Jesus and the narrative and the historical event of what took place, which is very important. But you can focus in on the narrative and the story of the coming of Jesus in this world and yet miss the deep meaning of what Christmas means on a deep spiritual plane. Now, in case you're getting hung up on my use of Christmas, I'm just using Christmas as an accommodative term to refer to the historical reality of the birth of Jesus. We can quibble all day long about the particular date of when it happened. That's immaterial. But recognizing the reality of the birth of Jesus is absolutely crucial. In fact, I would argue that while the church needs to certainly elevate the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, which is the message of the gospel, the historical reality that Jesus died on the cross, that he was raised from the dead, that he ascended to the Father and is now at the Father's right hand, is crucial to who you are as a believer in Jesus. But none of that would have happened had it not been for the birth of Christ. And so the birth of Jesus and the deep theological significance of what the event of the actual birth of Jesus means is just as crucial to your faith as anything else. In fact, it is something so crucial that the Apostle John did not want us to miss it. Our text this morning, although the screen is going to say John, that's my fault, it actually is 1 John, not the Gospel of John. 1 John chapter 1 and verse number 1 says this from John's first little letter called 1 John. He begins this way, writing to believers. We proclaim to you the one who existed from the beginning, whom we have heard and seen. We saw him with our own eyes, and we touched him with our own hands. He is the Word of life. This one who is life itself was revealed to us, and we have seen him. He was with the Father, and then he was revealed to us. We proclaim to you what we ourselves have actually seen and heard, so that you may have fellowship with us. We proclaim to you what we've seen and heard. He says our fellowship, verse number 3, is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. We're writing these things so that you may fully share our joy. Now, in this short little passage, 1 John chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, there are two major ideas that John wants to impress upon your heart. And that is this: first of all, the teaching of Christmas, and secondly, the purpose of Christmas. So first look at the teaching of Christmas, the teaching of the birth of Jesus. John begins in verse number 1 by saying, this is what we proclaim to you. This is a proclamation. This is a message that we are continually sharing with everybody. It is a truth that we believe you need to know. This idea of proclaiming something indicates that John the Apostle is thoroughly convinced in the truthfulness and reality of this event and believes that everybody needs to know about it. It needs to be proclaimed. In other words, what John is saying is this is a belief. It is a teaching. But not only is it a teaching, it is not just any philosophical teaching. It is a teaching that is based upon historical reality, something that he and others personally experienced. Christmas is both, in the sense of being a teaching, it is both doctrinal and it is historical. In the first place, Christmas is doctrinal. This teaching is doctrinal. Now, the word doctrine really gets a bad rap these days. Because for a lot of us, when we hear the word doctrine, we hear something very rigid, something very, that somebody believes, and it's very exclusionary and very domineering, and nobody wants to hear about doctrine. But the word doctrine just simply means teaching. It just simply means something that, yes, you insist upon because you have a faith position in something. It's not necessarily something you can scientifically prove, but it is something that you are convinced is the case, so much so that you're wanting to convince other people of it. And you say, well, wait a minute, that's what we don't like in our pluralistic culture. We don't like this idea that somebody would have this belief that they are so thoroughly convinced of that they would try to insist that others believe it as well. But now think about this. It's not just religious folk that have doctrine. Everybody has some kind of doctrine. You can be the most worldly, secular person, and yet you will hold to certain personal beliefs that you believe are so true that you want to insist that other people believe it as well. Everybody has some type of doctrine, some type of assumption, some type of faith position about who you believe God is or is not. And you're so convinced of it that you want to persuade others to believe it. Everybody has doctrine. So it's not a matter of whether or not you're a doctrinal espousing person or not. Everybody is. It's just a question of which doctrine is true. Which doctrine should you hold? And for John, he says the doctrine he's convinced of is the doctrine of the incarnation. This word incarnation just simply means this, that God himself, the creator of the universe, came into the world himself in bodily form. You see, this is what John is saying. He's saying this is the doctrine that is the basis of the Christian belief system, that God took up human nature, that the Word who was with the Father became flesh, as he would write in his gospel in chapter 1. This is the premier doctrine of Christianity. And this is what John is saying. He's saying this is what we're proclaiming to you. This truth, this idea. And we're trying to persuade other people, everybody that we know, to believe it. And why was he so thoroughly convinced of this doctrine of God coming to the world in bodily form? Why is he so convinced of it that he wants to try to persuade everybody he comes in contact with that it's the reality? Because it's not something that somebody just told him, something that somebody somehow convinced him of, but instead it is something he had personally experienced himself. Christmas, you see, is not just doctrinal. For John, it is historical. That is to say, John is saying, what we're telling you about this Jesus is not some kind of legend that was passed down to us. Whenever you look at what the Bible has to record about the events of the life and times and ministry of Jesus Christ, and you look at it closely, you will notice that the Bible records many small, little, minute details in the story of Jesus, many details that seem to have nothing to do whatsoever with advancing the story. Small little details about how many fish were caught, or how far somebody walked, that doesn't really seem to have anything to do with advancing the story. In fact, many of those small details actually reflect rather poorly on the primary characters that are described in the story. In other words, what I'm saying to you is that many people have noted, and if you'll look carefully, you'll see it too, that the Bible does not carry the same characteristics of ancient legends. It carries the characteristics of actual eyewitness accounts. But then also notice that John says he was an eyewitness. This is not a legend somebody gave me, and neither it is some lie that was concocted in the minds of Jesus' closest followers. In other words, some would say, well, this Jesus, he gathered a rather large following and people really looked up to him, and so they began to invent a lot of stories about him, and they started to put upon him this identity that he was God in the flesh, that somehow this was a lie that was concocted along the way. But when you look at what the Bible says, you have a passage like in 1 Corinthians 15 where Paul says, when Jesus was risen from the dead, proving his identity and his deity and conquering death, he appeared to 500 people all at once, many of whom, Paul says, are still living. Now, why would Paul say that? He's saying, look, this is not a lie. 500 people saw it, and if you got any questions about it, go ask them. In other words, the events that took place were written within 40 to 50 years of when they happened. It's not like 100 years later and all the eyewitnesses are dead and you can't check it out. You can't ask anybody. He's saying, no, there were a lot of people that saw this. Many of them are still living. If you've got any questions, go talk to an eyewitness. These are not lies. They're not legends. They are historical facts that took place, and we are eyewitnesses of that fact. Now, you say, well, but how important is it that I believe in the historical truthfulness of these events? How important is it that I believe in the doctrine of the incarnation of Christ, God coming to visit the world in human form? How important is it? Does doctrine really matter? Some people will say, well, doctrine doesn't matter. All that matters is you just be a good person. Just live a good moral life. But do you realize that those that would say just live a good moral life, that is their doctrine. That is a doctrine. You know what doctrine it is? When you say all you need to do is live a good life, it is the doctrine of salvation by works. And that is a false gospel. And you may not recognize it to be a false gospel, but if you're living by the life principle that says doctrine doesn't matter, all that matters is that I live a good life, that is unsustainable. It will crush you underneath the burden of your own expectation. You will not be able to live a good enough moral life to satisfy your own conscience, let alone the judgment of God in the final analysis. You see, you can't be saved by a doctrine of all that matters is that I live as a good person. You need somebody to do for you what you are unable to do for yourself, and that is the teaching of the incarnation of God in human flesh. That is Jesus Christ. You see, this is the teaching of Christmas. But secondly, the purpose of it. What is the purpose of Christmas? Well, in verses 3 and 4, John says that Christmas has a special purpose of providing two things that you and I desperately need. We absolutely, desperately need a relationship with God and a joyfulness about life. First of all, we need a relationship with God, and that's what the doctrine of Jesus coming into the world in human flesh, the doctrine of Christmas, what it teaches us, what it provides us, is a relationship with God. You see, a relationship with God might seem to be something nebulous. It might seem to be something otherworldly, something that is unattainable. But the doctrine that John says here is that Jesus coming into human flesh, we've seen him, we've touched him. He was accessible. Relationship with God is graspable. It is something that you can attain. It is something that you can have, something that can be yours. God is inviting you into a personal relationship where God says, I love you enough to come to you and I want to be your friend. It is something deeply personal. You can have, because of Jesus coming into the human flesh, you can have a personal relationship with the God of creation. That's what the incarnation says. He comes and dwells among us. But a relationship with God is not meant to simply be something that is personal to you. It is something that is meant to be shared in community. He says that you may have fellowship with us. Did you hear that, what John says? This is why we're proclaiming this to you. What we've seen and heard about the Word of God coming in human flesh, the reason why is so that you can have fellowship with the Father and you can have fellowship with us. God doesn't want to just save you individually. He wants to build a forever family. He wants to build a family where you and I can know with certainty that we're a part of God's family, both now and forever. So Christmas provides the avenue for that kind of relationship with God in heaven because Jesus came to us. We could never, ever, by our own performance, climb our way up to God. So God takes the initiative and He comes down to you. So Christmas provides that relationship, but it also provides joy. He says, we write this verse number 4, so that you can know the fullness of the joy of this reality. In other words, John is saying that there is a kind of joy that is down deep underneath the surface of everything else in your life. In other words, Jesus came to provide what Keller calls a subterranean joy. That no matter what is happening in life, no matter what strain is put upon you, no matter what circumstances you may be going through, no matter what evils may be attacking you or difficulties or trials you may be going through, that Jesus came to provide a deep inner sustainable joy within the inner being of yourself that can endure no matter what happens on the surface. See, this is the truth that we so desperately need. What can give me confidence and endurance in this life, in the good days and in the bad, in the times of victory and in the days of immense trial? Only by some type of joy that is not based upon my circumstance, but is a joy that is injected into me from somewhere else. And that is the joy that he says we've come to proclaim, that is possible for you by believing in this message, this teaching about the coming of Jesus. It can provide that kind of joy. And it's a joy that we need. And it's a joy that would tie us together as one. It is the joy that brings us together as God's people. You see, if you've got this kind of joy, it creates a way for you to be free with people and the people around you, even amid your pain and the difficulties of life, because there's something that we share that is otherworldly, something that is beautiful, something that is higher and transcends all of the trials and struggles of this life. Christmas provides that kind of joy, and it's the kind of joy that John was proclaiming, the kind of joy that we should proclaim and invite others to be a part of as well. Years ago, whenever I was first, I think, coming into an awareness of the beauty of what it means to say that God would do for me what I cannot do for myself by sending Jesus to me. I was reading through a copy of J.B. Phillips' translation of the New Testament in modern English. I was reading through the book of Romans. It was the first time that the reality of the gospel finally dawned upon me for the first time. To realize the beauty of salvation by grace through faith was reading through Paul's letter to the Romans in J.B. Phillips' translation. J.B. Phillips made a statement during his lifetime when he said, when you stop and think about it, and he wrote this beautiful narrative about it, but he says, when you stop and think about it, when you look at the planet Earth, he says, imagine that the angels of heaven are looking at all of the universe that God has created in all of its magnificence and glory. They can point to one little planet and say, that one is the visited planet. That is the planet that our Creator chose to visit. The truth about Christmas, you see, church, is something that should not be hidden among us. But instead, the truth of Christmas is that we proclaim that this is the visited planet. This is the place where God Himself came in the form of Jesus Christ. And John says it was historical. It was a reality that we saw. It is something that actually happened. It is something you should base your life on, because only through this truth can you have a relationship with God and have confidence in it to know that you have a joy that transcends anything life may throw at you. It is a doctrine to base your life upon because it gives you purpose and gives you confidence, and it is the basis of true joy. This morning, I ask you on this Christmas morning, do you realize the true meaning of Christmas? It is that God came to you. Will you recognize that amazing gift and not just honor that truth as some fleeting ideal once a year, but instead be so caught up in the reality of that you would give your whole life to Him and found your life on the truth of Jesus Christ? If we